Hi, in this video I'm going to talk about many different ways to create arm construction specifically around the elbow, but also some of the parts into the hand. We'll start with Flexi Binding, the default binding for bones and vectors. We'll go through many different approaches, and including my favorite, which is point binding with Flexi Binding, including both of those together. We'll talk about smart bones and even get to the latest one in 11.2, which is sketch bones, which is really pretty cool. So if you're not already an expert with all the different types of binding and creating bones for the arm, specifically around the elbow, hopefully after this I'll have gone through just about every technique there is and why you would choose each one, and help you figure out what is best for the characters that you want to create. Okay, so hopefully you're already very familiar with using Anime Studio in general. You know how about selecting points and shapes and how to create those things, so you how to draw those. That's not what this tutorial is about. Okay, so we've got an arm here. There's a zombie arm, and it has three basic shapes: the hand, and then the arm, and the sleeve. So that's what we have on one layer, and what I'm going to do is create the bones for the arm. So typically we start at the shoulder and go to the elbow, then from the elbow to the hand, and then I'm just going to come out for the hand, not through each individual fingers, just the hand overall. Now by default, Anime Studio will use Flexi Binding, and if I select the manipulation tool, I can manipulate the arm and move around, and all I've done is drawn those three bones. Now something that you'll see is, as around the elbow it's not such a good thing. We'll talk about that later. And as I move the hand, it kind of distorts. I can fix that a little bit by changing the size of the influence, so that helps a little bit, and I can do that for the individual bones, and you can see that will affect some things, but it's still not perfect. But it's a real easy thing to do if all you care about is just some kind of animation like that. Now with real characters, you're not just going to have the bones associated with the arms, you're also going to have bones associated with the rest of the body. Now if you just go into Anime Studio and just create all the bones, what you'll start to notice is, as I move, all of the bones are influencing. And so you might get something strange like this happening because this body bone is affecting this point in his arm. So to fix that, you want to select just the bones in the arm, then select the layer that you're trying to deal with, here the arm layer, and go to Bone and select Use Selected Bones for Flexi Binding. Once you do that, then as I manipulate the arm, the other bones will not affect it. And so you can do the Flexi Binding for just the arm. Now as we see, as we do the manipulation of the hand, it's okay, and there are some problems with the elbow, but let's take a look at something else you could do with the Flexi Binding, specifically the hand. Oops, sorry about that. Here I created bones in the hand as they go through the fingers. Now the hand is still the exact same objects that we saw, that we've been looking at before, that same shape, but we just added bones into the fingers. And what that means now, and I haven't done anything except for, again, selected all the bones and made them the ones that do the Flexi Binding, and now I can manipulate this hand a little bit nicer, and it's kind of interesting what I can do without really much work. Now the one thing that you do want to notice is you want to turn the bone strengths so that they're about the size of the finger. That's what helps it work effectively. So that's a very nice use of Flexi Binding, because I didn't have to bind all the individual points in the hand. Take a look at all of these points that are there, and in the fingernails and everywhere. I just drew the lines and told it to Flexi Bind that whole set of points. Now, in addition to Flexi Binding, there's also region binding. So if I go to the layer information and look at bones, it will show me region binding. So you can do that. But really, there's not a whole lot of difference there. Let me show you the Flexi Binding with basically the same kind of rig. And as I move the hand, you can see how it behaves. If I go to region binding, it behaves a little bit differently, because what's happening, if you'll notice closely, is that these points over here in the thumb are not being moved at all because they don't lie within this red region, whereas for the Flexi Binding they are moved. So that can make some subtle differences, and depending upon the character that you're doing, you might want to use that, but I don't really recommend it. So Flexi Binding is nice for very quick and easy things. You can do some multi-bone Flexi Binding, so that's really nice for things like the hand. Region binding is not that recommended, and there's better ways to do a lot of these things. So let me now talk about the smooth joint. So underneath the bone, there is an option here that says create smooth joint for bone pair. We'll talk about that. And as we talked about with Flexi Binding, we mentioned that as I bend this elbow, we get some problems over here. So that smooth joint is intended to help fix that. And so here I've got an arm that's just used the normal Flexi Binding, and I can move those fingers just like I was showing before. But now what I'm going to do is I'm going to select the two bones that are around the elbow, and I'm going to go bone. Oops, I have to select the layer, the arm layer. Now I select bone, create smooth joint for the bone pair. And now, as I turn, that elbow is pretty nice in terms of how it moves. Now, if you're doing vectors, you want to make sure you've got points right around that center area. But as long as you do, then it bends that arm pretty nicely. And if you have more points, it can even look a little nicer than this. However, there's a downside to this smooth joint type of thing, and that is, if I've got all these other bones that are trying to Flexi bind the hand, what happens if I move look at this, it doesn't work anymore, because basically the smooth joint is just dealing with these two bones, and so actually I would have to have the hand on a completely separate layer. So if all of these shapes are on a single layer, then I really can't use that for the vector, or even for bitmaps for that matter. Okay, so now, when is smooth joint a good thing? Well, really it's a really nice thing when you're dealing with bitmaps. Now again, you will have to have your hand on a separate layer, but here what I have is I have a hand and I have my arm on two different layers, and all I've done is created that smooth joint for the elbow, and as I go to manipulate it, you can see that that does pretty nicely. In fact, as we zoom in and we go to preview, we actually see that it's actually smoother than what you see in the preview. And then for the hand, I can just go in and manipulate those fingers like I did with before, because the hand is on a separate layer. Now, since this is a bitmap, we do see things like this over here, because it's not as nice as vectors, but that's really the best way to do it if you've got bitmaps. Unless, of course, you make everything on its own layer. Okay, so with the problem that we've already talked about, the elbow, in the Flexi Binding, you can actually do the smart bone corrections here. Now, I've got another tutorial that talks about how to create the smart bones, but that's all I have here is just a single smart bone action for the right forearm, and this is using Flexi Binding, except for it's got smart bone corrections here. And so that may be all that you need. That's pretty nice and pretty quick. Okay, so what we've talked about so far really are techniques that are there to help you understand how that works and some of the historical things, but I personally don't use them very often. I think the smooth joint is okay for bitmaps, but really I prefer a different approach. They're much better approaches, I believe, for doing the arm construction. Okay, so the better constructions are ones that are based upon an older technique of layer binding. So in this case, think about the cutout puppet type of thing. So each part of the arm, so we've got the right hand is on a separate layer, and the right forearm is on a separate layer, and the right upper arm is on a separate layer. So each portion is on a separate layer, and then we bind each one to its adjacent bone. When you do that, this is the kind of behavior that you get. Now, the thing that I like best about these techniques is that they allow you to pass the arm over the top by the shoulder. I think that that's a pretty common kind of thing. If you remember with the other techniques that we've done so far with flexi binding, I have to stop before I get all the way over. In this case, I can have the arm go all the way around, and you can see as you look near the elbow, it still looks nice. And this is very easy to set up with just a little bit of care. And it can be used just as easily with bitmaps as it can with vectors. Okay, so how do we do this? The whole thing starts with a reference layer at the elbow. As I zoom in, I've created a little circle, and the thickness of that circle is the same thickness as the stroke for the character, and I have a crosshairs in the middle. Now this reference layer helps me set everything up so it looks nice. So the key is that the upper arm bone needs to end right at the middle of that crosshair, and the forearm bone needs to start right at the middle of that crosshair. Then what I'm going to do is the upper arm is going to be actually at the lowest level, and it's going to have a half of circle centered right around that crosshair area. And if I do the reference, you'll see that it goes right over that area. That's very important. And as I zoom in and look at the points, we will have points just like the half circle, and the curvature here is typically going to be all the way off, so it's a sharp angle, but it's a smooth curve at this part right here. Now the forearm is going to look a little bit different because it's going to go on top, and it's again going to be centered so that it terminates right on those rings, so that these lines come and overlap those lines. And we also do something else a little bit interesting, and that is that center point, we just move it down, and we don't have a stroke between these 2 points here. And so when you put them together, this is what it looks like. And now as I move the arm, we'll see that's the kind of behavior that you have, and that looks, very nice. You can see we have the overlapping, so you can see depth to the character. And all we do when we have the bones is we bind those bones directly to those layers, and so it's very easy to create this. For the hand, we don't have to be quite as, in this particular case, as careful, because it matches pretty nicely, but you can do that same kind of thing. If I get rid of the hand, you'll see that the forearm has that rounded end on here. So the layer that's on the bottom has the rounded shape. The one on top, whatever layer is on top, has the stroke removed. So that's a very well-known technique that has been used, and it's very, very useful and very powerful, but there are even better ways in Anime Studio. But that's the foundation of the more advanced techniques. Notice that in this one I have to have many different layers for just this one arm. I have to have them so that I can bind each layer to a particular bone. But like I said, this will work well for bitmaps. Now in Anime Studio, I don't actually have to put everything on a separate layer. Now I'm going to turn off the reference layer, but all my other layers, all of the arm shapes are on a single layer called right arm. Now in this case, I cannot bind a layer to a bone. Instead, what I'm doing is I'm using point binding. And you can see the results of that. I'm using the exact same techniques, except for instead of using layer binding, I'm using point binding. In the upper arm bone, I have all of these points bound to that bone. And in the forearm, I have all of those points bound to the forearm bone. And then all of the hand points are bound to that last bone. And so then as we manipulate it, it looks exactly the same as if we bound the layers, and behaves that same way. Now notice I do have a reference layer so I could set this up, and it's on a separate layer, because if it's on the same layer, then that will show rendering in the final output. Now that's pretty close. We're getting better, but we can still improve on this. So now we've come to what I consider to be my favorite approach for a very fast and easy and powerful way to deal with arm. So the first improvement is, instead of using a circle that's your reference circle on a completely different layer, let's do this. Let's use the exact same style as the arm, and I'm going to make a circle that's the exact same size as that reference circle and in the same location. And it will actually be my elbow. Now for the old-time users, you may be familiar with patch layers. I didn't really go over that because they're very complex, and this is a better approach, and there's lots better ways with smart bones than using the patch layers. But you can think of this as a patch. This is the elbow here. And all I'm going to do is join the upper arm and lower arm right on top of this elbow. So it serves as both the reference layer and the elbow patch. So let me just show you real quickly what will happen if I don't have that patch. And you'll see the patch helps me take care of that gap. But when that patch is in there, it fills the gap, and we have that overlap like we like. Now here's another very valuable thing for having that patch, and that is you have the patch as the lowest shape on this layer, and because you can have animated shape ordering in Animation Studio Pro 11, notice that I can have this overlap so that the forearm is in front of the upper arm, or if I just move it down, I have the overlap so that the upper arm is in front of the forearm. Now the construction is very similar to the layer binding that we did. It's just that both the upper arm and the lower arm are terminated with no stroke, no curving part. The reference circle itself provides all the curve that we need. But again, everything needs to be centered right exactly at where those two bones connect. And most importantly, where the forearm bone center is. Now, if you've never done point binding, all you need to do is select the bone that you want to bind the points to. Then select this tool right here and select all the points that are associated with that bone, and then click on the Bind Points button. Now, I don't have to bind all the points. I can use Flexi Binding for some points, and that's where the next interesting part here is I'm using Flexi Binding for the hand. And so I'm using a combination of point binding for the arm and Flexi Binding for the hand. So that makes it very powerful, and it's also very quick to construct. Now, of course, you could create switch layers if all the bones match up with the hand, but this is just one of the techniques. And it provides what I consider to be the most powerful approach, at least for the simple, quick techniques. Okay, now I'm going to focus on the elbow and talk about another technique that is very interesting, but can be done better with smart bones now. So I'm going to turn off the shapes, but we're still going to have that kind of concept of we've got an upper arm, we've got the lower arm, and then we have, instead of a reference layer, we've got a shape here that's going to fill in that gap. And so what we're going to do at the elbow, instead of having a circle, we're going to terminate the upper arm with sharp points here, and terminate the lower arm with sharp points there. and we're going to put a point in the center on either side, right where that elbow bends. Then what we're going to do is we're actually going to create 3 shapes. We're going to create a shape for the upper arm, and it will look like that and terminate like we have been talking about. We'll create a shape for the lower arm. Again, it terminates the way we've been discussing. And then the middle shape will look like this. We don't need to have any area go across here. Now remember that construction, because we're going to use that also for the smart bone approach I'll show next. But let's focus on what happens with the mandcon arm. And the interesting part here is we've created 2 bones that go from the joint of the elbow out to the point on the edge of the arm. Now if we look at the parents, both of these little tiny bones are children of the upper arm, as well as the forearm is also a child of the upper arm. And here's the very critical point. We have the bone that goes all the way out to that point, but we want to go for each of these bones, and we're going to have the angle control bone to be the forearm bone, and we're going to set the value at 0.5. We do that for both of these bones. That's exactly what we want to do, and that's the thing that makes everything work properly. Now the way the binding works is all of the forearm bones need to be bound to this forearm, just like we've done before, and the upper arm points are bound to the upper arm bone, just like we've done before, and we just bind this, the edge point, to this little bone, and the edge point on the other side to the other little bone. So it's pretty clear how you want to bind those points. Now as I move the arm, it does very similar to what we had seen before with the other approaches. One of the advantages is I don't have to create a reference circle or anything. These points are linked together automatically because they're connected. Now the same thing, since Anime Studio Pro has layer ordering that you can animate, you can do the same thing that we were talking about, which is have the overlap before or behind the upper arm. And of course you can still do the flexi binding or point binding, however you want to do, on the hand. Now you can do the same kind of control using smart bones, instead of having those little bones from the elbow joint to the edge. And that all depends upon what you like. Now the arm construction at the elbow would be the same as for the mandcon arm. The difference is that you don't need those little bones. Okay, so if you like the arm to be able to swing over the top like I do, there's a trick to that. And let me show you what it is. It happens right when the arm reaches the top. So all I'm going to do is between the 24th frame and the very next frame, I'm going to switch the top point and the bottom point. Now, up until this point, I've just been making sure that that edge point makes a nice smooth elbow at the bottom. So notice before I get to frame 24, it's the left edge that's on the bottom, but after frame 25, it's the right edge that's on the bottom. So look at that a little bit more. The right edge after 25, the left edge is on the bottom before 24. Now let me move out keyframe. It's at 25, and you might be able to see that a little easier. Notice that what happens is, there you go, you got the point switching. That's what's happening. But I just put that keyframe right next to it, and it happens instantaneously. So then from frames 25 on out to the 48, I just make sure that those points move to give you a smooth elbow. Now, the other advantage of the smart bones is with the mandcon, you can take care of that elbow joint, but that's all that it takes care of, is that one little point. Well, if you're using smart bones, you can adjust anything. You can make the bicep bulge out, you can make the muscles in the forearm bulge. You can do all of those things all at once. So that's why the smart bone is really a better approach. Okay, what I want to talk about here is something that was super cool technique that's been added in Anime Studio Pro 11.2. Now, this may not be something that you'll use for the more professional or exact kind of animation, but it's definitely a fun thing, and if you want to do something quick and easy, this is a great little technique to play with. Now, it's probably originally designed more for flexible hoses or tentacles or things like that, but you can use it here for even the arm. So I'll have an arm constructed however I want here, and I'm going to use the same kind of construction techniques that we've been talking about. And I'm going to go to the bone layer, and right here is this new tool for these sketch bones. And I'm going to click on that tool, and I'm going to set the bone length. Now here I'm going to set it to 0.2, and all I'm going to do is draw a line from the elbow to the wrist. And now it's going to create a chain of bones. Now I'm going to go ahead and create another little line of bones here for this thumb. And just like for other bone that we've added bones here, I can press Alt and click on a bone and set that that's now going to be the parent. And I'm going to draw a little line through that finger, Alt, and click, and draw a line here through this finger. Now I'm going to go from this one, Alt, click, and draw a line there. And the cool thing is, that's all I have to do to set this up. Now, to see it in action for animation, I can't really manipulate it. I mean, I can go in here and manipulate these bones individually, but really the cool way is once I get into a frame, not frame 0, I can go to that pencil tool and just start on a circle and redraw, and now the arm will bend or move however I want it to do, and I can do the same thing for the fingers, however I want them to pose. And so it's a really interesting way to do things, and you can animate very quickly and easily that way. Now, of course, for the arm, we've got this kind of a hose, rubber hose kind of look, but if you change the length of the bones, you might get different behaviors that you'd like differently. Oh, and in addition, you can also scale the bones. So if I draw longer, then the hand gets longer, so you can get that stretch and squash kind of look, so maybe even get some perspective appearance. Lots of different things that you can try, so give that a try and see what you think.